The rain fell against the windows of Balmoral Castle like 1,000 tiny drums, each drop a persistent echo of the grief that had settled over the ancient stone walls. Outside, the Scottish Highlands were shrouded in a gray mist, the beauty of the landscape obscured by a veil of tears that mirrored the sorrow within. It was August 31st, 1997, and the world, as the young princes knew it, had just ended. In a quiet wood-paneled room, their father, Prince Charles, sat opposite his two sons, and his face a mask of barely controlled anguish. He had always been a man of complicated emotions, often struggling to express the depths of his feelings, but on this morning there was no room for pretense. The news he had to deliver was a parent's worst nightmare. 15-year-old Prince William watched his father's hands tremble as he spoke the words that would forever bifurcate his life into a before and an after. His mother, Diana, had been in a car accident in Paris. She was gone. And the initial information was fragmented, confusing, but the core of it was a brutal, unchangeable fact. William later recalled feeling utterly numb, his mind a chaotic swirl of disbelief and a desperate, aching confusion. He remembers thinking, almost rationally in its irrationality, "Why me? Why my mother? What did I do wrong?" It was a question born of the peculiar guilt that often accompanies sudden, catastrophic loss, a feeling that if only one had been different, or better, or more loving, and the universe might have been persuaded to take a different path. Beside him, 12-year-old Prince Harry was a study in frozen shock. He simply could not, would not, believe it. In the way of children, and perhaps of all humans when faced with the inconceivable, his first instinct was denial. He refused to cry, not out of a lack of feeling, but because accepting the news meant accepting a reality too painful to comprehend. Their father, though drowning in his own tumultuous sea of grief, a grief complicated by his divorce from Diana just a year prior and the public's enduring fury towards him, did what he could. He held them. He didn't have the right words, because no words exist for such a moment. But his presence was a tether, a shared sorrow that bound them in their shock. Harry would later praise his father for his protection. Acknowledging the impossible situation Charles was in, having to tell his young sons that their mother, the most famous and beloved woman in the world, would never be coming home. In the days that followed, the princes were cocooned within the walls of Balmoral, their grandmother, the Queen, ordering all newspapers and radios removed so they wouldn't have to see the world's grief plastered across every front page. It was a gesture of profound, if old-fashioned, protection. But soon, they had to leave the cocoon. They had to return to London to face a world that was openly weeping. As they drove through the gates of Kensington Palace, they were met not by silence, but by a sea of flowers, a carpet of cellophane-wrapped bouquets and teddy bears that stretched as far as the eye could see. People were everywhere, their faces streaked with tears, reaching out as if to touch the boys who were now the living embodiment of their lost princess. Harry remembers the hands of strangers reaching out to hold his, their skin damp from wiping their own tears. It was overwhelming, a tsunami of public grief that threatened to drown two boys who were trying to keep their own private sorrow contained. The most harrowing moment came on the day of the funeral. The decision was made that the two princes would walk behind their mother's coffin in the long, silent procession to Westminster Abbey. It was a decision that has been debated ever since. For William, it felt like a surreal, out-of-body experience. He later confessed that all he wanted to do was find a room, a quiet, dark room, and cry until he couldn't cry anymore. Instead, he had to walk. He had to walk with his brother and his father and his grandfather, with the eyes of the world upon him, the weight of history and protocol pressing down on his young shoulders. He kept his eyes fixed forward. on his face a portrait of stoic endurance. He felt he had to. His mother's brother, Earl Spencer, walked beside them, a pillar of strength. For Harry, then just 12, the walk was a blur of noise and sorrow. He made a solemn pact with himself that day. He would never show his pain in public. He would lock it away. He maintained this composure throughout the service, even as the music swelled and the eulogies were read. But the dam nearly broke when his friend, Elton John, sang a rewritten version of Candle in the Wind. He felt the walls he had built begin to crumble, and it took every ounce of his remaining strength to hold back the flood. In that moment, he was not a prince, but a little boy, lost and utterly broken, walking behind his mother's flag-draped coffin. Years passed. The intense, sharp agony of that week softened into a persistent, dull ache, a background hum of loss that would accompany them for the rest of their lives. Both princes channeled their grief into their work, particularly into mental health advocacy, a direct response to the pain they had carried for so long in silence. William, in particular, grew into a man who consciously rejected the royal family's traditional stiff upper lip. He had seen where that stoicism led, to buried trauma and unspoken pain. He became known for his empathy, his willingness to show emotion, a trait he had inherited directly from his mother. This new chapter of his life was defined by his wife Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Her presence was a quiet revolution in the House of Windsor. She brought with her not just grace and beauty, but a profound emotional intelligence and a stabilizing warmth that had been missing for so long. William, who had spent his adolescence and young adulthood guarding his heart, found in her a safe harbor. She understood his losses, not as historical footnotes, but as living, breathing parts of who he was. And as they built their own family with their 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, the specter of his mother's death, while never absent, became easier to bear because he had built a life filled with the love she would have wanted for him. It was during this period of hard-won peace that the most unexpected of bonds began to form. Queen Camilla, the woman once reviled as the primary cause of his parents' misery and, by extension, the catalyst for the tragic chain of events that led to his mother's death, became a source of quiet solidarity. For William, Camilla had always been a complex figure. He had witnessed the pain her affair with his father had caused his mother. He had seen the tabloid photos and heard the whispered conversations. The animosity was a deep-rooted family legacy. However, the relentless, unforgiving nature of royal duty and personal crisis has a way of redrawing battle lines and forging alliances in the most unlikely of places. The turning point was a shared shadow: cancer. In early 2024, the unthinkable happened twice within the walls of the monarchy. First, it was announced that King Charles had been diagnosed with an undisclosed form of cancer. Then, just weeks later, in a statement that sent shockwaves around the world, the Princess of Wales revealed that she, too, was in the early stages of preventative chemotherapy. The future king and the present king were united by a common, terrifying enemy. Suddenly, the palace corridors, usually filled with the quiet hum of protocol and procedure, were filled with a more profound silence, the silence of worry. William, now the heir apparent, had to step up. He had to balance the terrifying reality of his wife's illness, the mother of his young children, and with the increased public duties that his father's absence demanded. And in the eye of this perfect storm stood Camilla. She had been by Charles's side through his own diagnosis and treatment, a constant, unwavering presence. She understood the peculiar hell of watching a spouse fight for their health while the world watches. She also understood the weight of the crown, the relentless pressure to appear strong even when you are crumbling inside. Jenny Bond, a former BBC royal correspondent, observed this new dynamic with a keen eye. She noted that times of adversity often bring people much closer together. For all the progress made in cancer treatment, it remains a fundamentally scary thing. And while Camilla and William put on a brave face for the world, and no doubt for their spouses, there were bound to be times when they confided in one another. There are so very few people that a senior royal can trust absolutely. In that rarefied, gilded cage, Camilla, the woman he had once resented, became one of that number for William. And it was a two-way street. William offered his moral support to Camilla as well. This brings us to the moment captured in the title, a moment that encapsulates this entire, sprawling, multi-generational saga of love, loss, resentment, and reconciliation. It was a private family gathering, away from the flashing bulbs and the scrutinizing gaze of the press. Perhaps it was at Balmoral, on the same castle where he had learned of his mother's death, or maybe at Highgrove, his father's beloved country estate. The exact location is unimportant. What matters is the scene. King Charles, though in remission, was having a difficult day. The treatment, while successful, had sapped his strength, leaving him frail and vulnerable in a way the public never sees. The weight of his recent health scare, combined with the ever-present burden of kingship, had momentarily overwhelmed him. He sat in a chair, his gaze distant, his shoulders slumped in a rare moment of complete defeat. An emotional wave, perhaps triggered by a memory, a photograph, or simply the exhaustion of it all, had washed over him. He was, in that instant, not the king, but simply a tired, frightened old man. Camilla, ever attuned to his moods, sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. She was the steady anchor in his turbulent sea. Across the room, William and Kate were present. Kate, herself pale and thin from her ongoing treatment, sat close to William. She knew the look in her father-in-law's eyes. She had seen it in her own mirror. It was the look of a person confronting their own mortality. Without a word, William rose and walked over to his father. He knelt beside his chair, a gesture of profound filial devotion that transcended all the years of distance and formality. He reached out and took his father's hand. He held it firmly. On a silent transmission of strength from son to father. It was a gesture of pure, silent desperation. Desperation to comfort, to heal, to take away the pain. He held Kate's hand in silent desperation, a plea against the cruel hands of time and illness. It was in this moment of profound vulnerability that Camilla's eyes met William's. She saw in him the same fierce, protective love she felt for Charles. She also saw the physical toll this was taking on his wife, who sat watching, be a silent sentinel of support. For Camilla, the priority was Charles's well-being. She knew that such intense emotional displays, while cathartic, could also exhaust him further. She knew that he needed to conserve his energy. It was not a lack of empathy for the poignant scene before her, but a deep, pragmatic understanding of her husband's limits. "William," she said, her voice soft but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. Her eyes, usually so guarded, and were filled with a complex mixture of gratitude for his love and a stern resolve. "Let him go. He needs to rest." It was an instruction that could have been interpreted as cold, as an assertion of her place as his primary caretaker, a subtle reminder of the hierarchy that Robert Jobson had written about. But in this context, it was something more nuanced. It was the plea of a wife who had spent months watching her husband fight for his life. It was the voice of experience, the one who knew exactly how much he could handle. William hesitated for a fraction of a second. He looked from his father's weary face to Camilla's determined one. 1,000 emotions flickered across his own features. The old resentment, the new respect, the overwhelming love for his father, the crushing weight of his own worry for Kate. He understood intellectually what Camilla was saying, but his heart, the heart of the little boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin, I was screaming at him to hold on,